Anwen leaned heavily against the enclosing walls of the secondary path. Tyler had been right about it being easier. What he'd forgotten to mention was that it was a lot longer and more winding. The only real advantage she could see was that there was no sheer drop-offs or ways to get lost. Taking a swig of water from her canteen, she looked towards her mother. Margo surveyed the path ahead, lifting her own canteen to her lips. They'd camped just past the head of the trail late the night before. Neither had talked much during the hike to the trailhead. The older mage wasn't sure what to say. Should she admit to listening to that one-sided conversation? Should she let it be? Now they were almost to the top of the path, waiting for events to unfold. If they'd navigated correctly, they should have only a turn or two until they reached the city. It wouldn't take more than a few minutes to reach the protrusion of rock that hid the space. But what would they find when they got there? Looking up, Margo tried to gauge the time. She'd never put much stock in watches, but wished she'd had one now. Were the others in place? Had they made it up the path unharmed? Had someone fallen on the way? She wished she knew.
We might move in a bit closer,
she finally said as she looked back at her daughter. Following her mother's example, Anwen moved further up the path. They were now within a turning of the city. She rubbed clammy hands against her pants, hoping they would stop shaking.
I think I can safely say this is the most nerve-wracking thing I've ever done,
she confessed. Margo smiled with compassion and took her daughter into her arms.
Whatever battles you are fighting inside, whatever struggles you are facing, just know I have faith in you.
She pulled away just enough to look into her eyes.
And remember that you were born for this.
Taking a step or two back, Margo reached for the chain she carried around her neck, pulling it out. The ring she'd fiddled with back at Walter's home dangled from the end. The green gem flashed in the light, filtering down into the tunnel-like area.
Your grandmother gave me this when I turned 17,
she said with a reminiscent smile.
That's when I knew she was dying.
Anwen looked at her mother with concern.
Mom, are you trying to tell me something?
Horror welled up at the idea of losing her. Margo took the ring into her hand as she undid the chain's clasp with the other.
I won't coddle you with the idea that there isn't the possibility. We're heading into danger, have been this entire time. But it's where our fates have led us. It's never wise to go against prophecy. People have tried, and it didn't end well.
With a sigh, Anwen looked to the ground. Hadn't Tyler said something similar? Or was she remembering things that hadn't happened? A few tears leaked from her eyes.
I don't want to lose you,
she confessed.
I finally feel like I'm beginning to understand you. And what do? Talk like you won't make it back alive. You just can't do that, Mom.
Holding the ring out to her daughter, the mage only smiled.
We only have so much time given us in this life,
she reminded.
And if it is up to the fates that I am taken, then so be it. But if not, I will want this back. In the meantime, you may need it once you get inside the mountain.
She pressed the circular object into Anwen's hands.
This is a relic of the Cada line. There was only one made. It is a sign that you are the true and only heir to that title.
Clutching it fiercely in her hand, Anwen hugged her mother with all her being.
I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm not ready for that yet, and who knows?
She sniffled.
Maybe we'll all come out of this alive.
Margo stroked her daughter's hair.
Just remember who you are. You are the last keykeeper. You are my daughter. And somewhere out there,
she gestured towards the city,
is a dragon who is madly in love with you.
Anwen had to laugh as she sniffled.
How do you know?
Despite her skeptical remarks, she felt a warm glow flow through her. The brief image of kissing him came to the surface and she turned slightly red at the memory. Had he kissed her back? She wasn't sure. Shaking her head, her mother let out a low chuckle.
When you've lived as long as I have, and have seen many others in the same circumstance, it's easy to tell. Believe me, he would move heaven and earth for you.
A sudden explosion filled the air, making the ground quake. The loud sound of people crying out all at once filled the air as confusion reigned in the city.
That's our signal,
Margo announced as she grabbed her daughter's hand and squeezed it.
Get ready.
Walter counted down the seconds. In one hand he held a glass ornament filled with his homemade mixture of explosive powder and goo. In the other he held his watch. His job was to create the initial chaos that would call the mages towards the high-reaching arch. Having reached the appropriate mark, he tossed the crude grenade and ducked. Despite his assurances to Margo that they wouldn't do much, he knew better. These orbs packed a wallop and he didn't want to be caught in the aftermath. Not that he had to worry about that, but the resulting flash of light was more than enough to dazzle the eyes of any who looked that way. He resisted the urge to let out a little victory shout as the first tent burst into flames. If that didn't cause confusion, he didn't know what would. From her location near the top of the arching stone, Courtney held on for dear life. The ground rumbled underneath her, making her perch more than precarious. Whatever Walter had packed into those small bombs of glass was potent. She found herself more than ecstatic to not be on the receiving end. She saw various mages run around like panic-stricken insects drawn to the flame. Except that it was far from comforting as another tent caught fire, then another. She almost giggled but kept it in as she pulled out the orb Walter had given her. She definitely had a new appreciation for the small glass spheres, but now it was her turn. They'd all decided Courtney could do the most damage if she were somewhere up high. They hadn't seen any guards. As such, Tyler had figured it was the best place for her to enact the next step of their plan. Divide and cause more chaos. Not even all the way to the top of the arch, Courtney had settled herself as securely as possible. She made sure to still have a decent view of the courtyard inside. Counting down from the initial explosion, she threw her orb with all her might. She added a push of wind behind it to lob it as far into the middle of the tents as possible. Courtney didn't wait for the explosion before lunging for the next handhold to the top of the archway.
That's a good thing I'm not afraid of heights,
she muttered as the blast filled the air with light and sound. The percussive force sent debris upwards in the main square. She had to momentarily shade her eyes as she reached the top of the natural formation. As soon as her vision cleared, Courtney realized there was a slight flaw in their plans. She wasn't alone. Joseph woke from his stupor at the first concussive blast. Shaking his head, he turned towards the cries of the internal sentries. They were running towards the chaos. Someone had infiltrated the city. With a feline grace, he vaulted to his feet. The knife Kira had given him came to his hand as if he'd called it. He couldn't see who was behind the explosion, but knew it wasn't part of the plan. And he couldn't let that happen. He held the blade steady with one hand, ready to pierce his flesh. Then a second blast rocked the ground, sending violent shivers up the stone archway. The knife fell from his fingers. It clattered towards the far side of the foot-wide arch. His eyes went wide in panic. His breath heaved at the possible implications should he lose that knife. For a brief moment, his true self tried to assert authority over his body, telling him this was all crazy. He shouldn't be there. And why was he so obsessed with a knife? But then the magic binding his soul took over again, and he went after the blade. Struggling up the remaining bit of stone, Courtney let out a gasp. Her opponent was going for a weapon. It only took her a moment to realize who she faced, and for that brief moment she hesitated. But, knowing what was at stake, she made to ram into the older teen. They couldn't have him interfering with their plans.
Hey guys, I'm going to be a bit busy,
she yelled as she almost tripped on a rock. Tyler bit back a curse as he followed Walter under the arch. Just in case the villagers hadn't figured out his true nature, he'd opted to stay in his mortal form, at least for the moment. There were plenty of male mages. He just hoped they'd buy the guys for now. It was too soon to pull out the big guns. But the important point right now was to make sure no one realized they were there. And for that cause, he cast a glamour around himself and Walter as the two entered the main courtyard. Just as Anwen had described, the stone structures were in a less presentable state. The pillars lining the walkways had been knocked down. The apparent goal had been to widen the courtyard, though most of the tents didn't start until a bit further back. And now a good 8 of those tents were on fire, thanks to both Courtney and Walter's efforts. The mages were scrambling to put out the flames. They seemed completely unaware of the two figures who all but marched right into their midst. Walter nodded to Tyler, a prearranged signal to drop the glamour as he continued on into the string of tents. With all the confusion, he easily blended in with the others. Unlike in a military campaign, he'd opted not to wear the traditional attire. Instead, he wore something that would blend in more with the mages around them. But if he had to, he could shed his outer layer of clothes to reveal camouflaged long johns. Disguised as one of the male mages, Walter made his way into the center of the tents, pretending to go for supplies. But when he reached the designated area, he didn't help his supposed compatriots. Instead, he set another tent on fire with a lighter, then he drew another sphere, aiming towards the far wall. That accomplished, he blended in as best as he could until he could find another place from which to lob his homemade bombs.